extreme cold, and wildfires, particularly their impact on air quality. Physical infrastructure, we mean to say the structure of the buildings, walls, bars, windows, and so on, as well as their systems like ventilation, heating and cooling, plumbing, etc. By social infrastructure, I mean maintenance and inspection practices, policies and their implementation or lack thereof, social norms, the discipline behavior, and any plans or informational practices that may or may not be instituted in the case of an emergency. To borrow a lens from abolitionist geographer Ruthie Gilmore, I argue that climate hazards endured in prison are one of the many ways that incarceration amounts to state-sanctioned exposure to premature death for incarcerated people who in the United States are disproportionately people of color. I will discuss the intersection of lived experience and the design of the spaces and places where that experience occurs, an intersection that Gilmore herself terms in a play on Raymond Williams, an infrastructure of feeling. My team contends that climate hazards imposed on the incarcerated population above and beyond their sentencing amounts to cruel and unusual punishment, and therefore is unconstitutional in the United States under the 8th Amendment. We conducted 10 interviews with formerly incarcerated individuals and 5 interviews with design professionals. Today, I'm going to focus primarily on the former category. And I want you to remember that these interviewees spent a significant amount of time inside. The average from the folks that I talked to was nearly 17 years time spent in carceral facilities. And collectively, these interviewees spent time in 17 different prisons and 9 different jails in Colorado. So I'm going to discuss some physical factors that influence exposure to climate hazards, social factors that influence exposure, a few additional findings that I believe merit further exploration, and some next steps for this project. And I'd love to solicit feedback on any and all of it. But I'll start with physical hazards. So the main ones that turned up in my interviews were location, age, and construction of different facilities. In terms of location of facilities, this is a map of carceral facilities in Colorado. That's prisons, jails, and detention centers. A previous study that our team conducted aggregated spatial data to create polygons of zones that we determined were at high risk of extreme heat, wildfire, and flooding, then overlaid those polygons on a map of carceral infrastructure. And we found that 74.5%, 3/4, of the studied facilities had a high risk exposure to at least one of those studied hazards. That correlates to over 33,000 people, or about 83% of the Colorado correctional population living in a facility with high exposure to at least one hazard. There's an inequity in this exposure, perhaps unsurprisingly, along lines of race. Black individuals were more likely to be exposed to extreme heat, Hispanic and Latino individuals to flooding based on where those people were incarcerated. We did not model extreme cold risk, although my qualitative research suggests that this is also a hazard of concern and should be investigated. Colorado does have some old facilities. The oldest is this one, Territorial, which opened in 1871. These old prisons often are not equipped with air conditioning or modern ventilation systems and have undergone significant wear and tear. One interviewee told me, quote, "They didn't have almost any ventilation system. It felt like there were holes in the walls where there was supposed to be ventilation systems," end quote. I heard rumors from multiple interviewees that at least 2 of the older facilities have been condemned for being out of code, and yet are allowed by the state to pay an annual fine instead of being forced to restructure to code. I haven't been able to corroborate this, but I take it seriously as a possibility. Age isn't the only problem. Inadequate construction has also meant that newer facilities are not free from issues. This one is Sterling, which was built in 1999. One interviewee told me that Sterling's buildings were constructed too quickly. Their pads have begun to sink into the ground, creating a gap between the wall and the pad. I was told by multiple interviewees that this was an issue. The gaps were large enough that bugs could crawl in from the outside, which of course creates problems when the air quality is bad or the temperature is extreme. Several interviewees told me that their facilities were not equipped with backup generators. And in the event that heat, cold, or fire disrupted the electricity grid, the default for these prisons is that they shut down and lock everybody in, which could be disastrous. In terms of social factors influencing exposure, primarily, I was thinking about, after these interviews, communication and policy during hazards, inadequate maintenance of facilities, the microeconomics of purchases at the commissary, and social norms around complaining. I'll discuss all of those. I won't be discussing, but we should also remember the social dynamics that determine who gets sent to prison. And in the United States, that is disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and people from impoverished communities. In terms of communication, several interviewees told me of the evacuation of Territorial, which happened during the 2013 Royal Gorge fire, which is pictured here. Evacuees were forced to leave almost all of their belongings behind, including books and any legal paperwork related to court cases they were involved in. Their fears were ignored and minimized. One interviewee, incarcerated in the next facility in line to be evacuated after Territorial, shared with me that when he asked about the fire, the CO, the correctional officer, brushed it off and said, "You're in a concrete box, concrete doesn't burn." During wildfires, staff did not provide or recommend wearing a mask or other face covering, even once those were readily available during the pandemic. Beyond wildfires, I also heard of yard policies remaining constant even on extremely hot days. One interviewee, a veteran, told me that the military was always mindful of how hot it was when deciding whether or not to train. And yet there was no comparable policy inside prison, people allowed to lift weights even at extreme temperatures. This resulted in heat strokes and sunburns so bad that they caused edema among the population. From the perspective of interviewees, the only emergency plans and procedures in place were designed to control the incarcerated population, not to keep them safe. For example, a lockdown during a riot. So far, my team has found no evidence of emergency response plans for any climate hazards. In terms of inadequate maintenance, I heard about improper filtration practices, not changing out filters regularly in the ventilation system. One interviewee told me that when an HVAC team finally did go in to do maintenance, they found 18 dead pigeons in the ventilation shaft. I heard stories of a buildup of dust and debris in the chases between cells through which ventilated air passes. And even when buildings were equipped with adequate cooling capabilities, such as a swamp cooler, the facility staff wouldn't always run those systems effectively. I heard that it was not uncommon for 3 to 5 hot weeks to go by in the summer before the cooling systems were turned on, and then they were often left on for weeks into a cold winter. This recalls a refrain that my team heard time and again in our interviews with design professionals. Even if you follow absolute best practices during the construction of the facilities, which is of course not always the case, that's not enough. Systems must also be implemented and maintained, and the social dynamics in the space must align with those best practices. Prisoners in the United States are often, or incarcerated people in the United States are often responsible for purchasing their own equipment. That includes clothing and other tools to control their body temperature. Sweatshirts, sweatpants, thermals, hats, and fans, etc., were only available for purchase at the end of every month, and then it would take almost a month for those items to deliver. So bad timing could mean 7 weeks without the tools you need to manage your temperature. These things are also expensive. A fan can cost $20, and you're probably making $12 to $15 per month from your prison job, and that's before purchasing any essential equipment like hygiene materials. Whenever legislation passed to raise state pay, I was told we would also always see a concurrent price hike at the commissary. There were social norms in place disciplining the urge to complain. I was told that complaining was frowned upon, and there was a prevalent understanding that complaints would often provoke repercussions and make whatever scenario you were complaining about worse. The standard correctional officer response was, one person told me, "If you haven't lost an arm, I don't want to hear about it." So in addition to those physical and social factors, we also learned that incarcerated people would modify their own places and spaces, their environment. I heard stories of people stuffing crumpled trash bags into cracks to keep the smoke out, wiping water on cracks during cold weather so water would freeze and provide a modicum of insulation. Or when it was hot, people would pour water all over the floor of their cell to a depth of half a centimeter, strip down to their underwear, and lie in the water in an effort to keep cool. We learned that there are differential impacts on subpopulations within the facility. That includes elderly people who are extra vulnerable to extreme temperature and poor air quality, people taking psychotropic medications, which impact your body's ability to thermoregulate. And this proportion could be up to 40% of the Colorado incarcerated population. And also people without friends or family who are able to send money into the prison to help with commissary purchases, less able to deal with these situations. Finally, we learned of a degree of normalization of these horrible conditions. A very standard response was along the lines of, look, these conditions were terrible, but you just have to put up with it. There are bigger things to worry about, like not getting stabbed, for example. One interviewee summed it up as, look, it's amazing what you're able to get used to. So next steps for this project, I'll be conducting focus groups early next year and follow-up interviews with all of those people. And we hope that these themes that I've drawn out in our preliminary research will be tested, and I'm expecting them to be affirmed given the universality of our responses so far. My team will also be running a few additional projects, including looking into carceral labor that is used for climate disaster mitigation and response. That includes my dissertation research, which is on incarcerated men who fight wildfires in Colorado. We're also looking into the public health impacts of hazards in Colorado and beyond. And we are working to establish a climate and incarceration research collaborative to forge research partnerships between academics and activist organizations. And finally, we built this installation as a way to engage the public in conversations about how climate change and incarceration intersect. So to close out, I would contend so far, at least, that our research suggests that these horrible conditions are inarguably cruel. Unfortunately, they don't seem to be all that unusual, and the evidence suggests that, in fact, they are closer to the norm. Of course, research like this faces very significant limitations, particularly limitations of access. Departments of correction make it difficult to talk to currently incarcerated people. But in terms of the impacts we hope this work might have, we want to see the use of a forensic architecture approach and the critical leveraging of engineering and architectural knowledge to become widespread as a way to identify facilities imposing cruel and unconstitutional harms, such as the ones I've discussed today, and highlight those facilities as candidates for early closure in our push towards decarceration and eventually abolition. Thank you.
It's time for questions. Yeah.
Are you? You're in charge, Sam. Are we doing questions after each talk? Or?
I'd like to do maybe.
I think after each.
Do you want me to help with that while you're doing it?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, you keep that.
Yes, so thanks. That was a fantastic presentation and so fascinating and important and disturbing work. I'm sure there's questions. Who would like to start? Andreea, would you?
This one's just a very quick question. I could see in the list of people that you had there listed on your project that you've got a lot from engineering and geography, and it was interesting to see that one of your crossover parts of your Venn diagram was from the social aspect. And in some senses, while a lot of the factors you're examining can be considered more discrete than otherwise, the social element is far less bounded in certain regards. And I'm wondering how you're kind of getting into that aspect of what's going on and deciding on which aspects you are and aren't focusing on.
Great question. Yeah, the presence of social considerations here is largely my influence. I am an ethnographer by training and a human geographer, and am convinced that, you know, studying the physical system itself is never the whole story. So far, and continuing, what we're trying to do as much as possible is center the voices and experiences of the people we're speaking with. These are formerly incarcerated people, so there is, you know, some difficulty in claiming generalization from this. In some ways, that makes it even more, it makes even more sense to me to talk about social factors, because those are things you might remember more clearly than where the ventilation shaft was located. And I think moving forward, I hope to dig into a little bit of like the multiple structures happening within social dynamics. So like there's an an incarcerated person dynamic. There is a dynamic between incarcerated people and correctional officers. There's a dynamic amongst officers. There's a dynamic between incarcerated people and wider society. All of those interplay, all of those intersect and create this reality. So it'll be interesting to dig into that. Did you have a?
Oh, follow-up question. Then we've got one from Julia, I think.
Just following up on that, just to kind of follow the ideas through. So have you not been able to actually go into the prisons themselves and investigate the infrastructure? Is this all from stories that you've heard from people? Is that right?
Great question. I haven't been able to access the inside of any facilities as a sanctioned part of this research. Through other means, I have entered these facilities. However, the spaces within the facilities I'm allowed to access, people have told me look and feel very different than their living spaces. So yes, this is all based on interviews with people who used to live in this situation and no longer do, with all the concomitant limitations to findings. And yet, I think in the absence of a fair and just society where we can hold these institutions and practices to account under the public eye, it's the best we can do.
Thanks. And I know we'll move on quickly, but I just know that Julia, did you have a question you wanted to? Yeah.
There's not enough time.
I think we can manage. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. During your talk, I was wondering whether at some point you get at towards climate resilience, because that's like the talk. And then you came up with RISE at the very end. I was like, wow. Do you, instead of saying like, hey, let's build facilities that are more resilient to climate hazard, do you also tackle climate change as a system? Is that kind of part of the research, or are there any interviewees who make that connection? So because you said abolition at the end, so then
Yeah, right. No to the last answer. My interviewees, if anything, are uncomfortable using language around climate change, mostly just because they're not familiar with the context. I had several interviewees say things like, I don't have any experience with climate change. And then I said, okay, what about extreme heat? And they're like, oh, I have a ton of experience with that. In terms of resilience, one thing we're not trying to make more resilient is the prison system. And that creates a very difficult scenario where we are trying to address harms and suffering for real living people right now, much as if you're, treating a pandemic, you want to treat the sick people while you seek out the root causes. It's difficult because there's real ways you can entrench these prisons by constructing, zero emission, trauma informed, beautiful environments where, as we heard in the plenary this morning, people are still incarcerated. A prison is a prison is a prison. So it's complex. The way we are moving forward is trying to say, look, we're trying to identify the worst actors and get rid of those. In terms of RISE and whether we're considering climate change as its own system, yes and no. My dissertation work is very much about how our broader society is mustering the labor necessary to respond to climate hazards, and leaning on systems of inequity and exploitation that already exist to do so. And whether that is entrenching us in a pattern that is not socially resilient in the long term, I would, shocker, say yes to that. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks to the other panelists. Sorry for rambling.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Ben. Now, is it Andrea and Monique next, or yes, or Ben? I'm not Ben. And
Yeah, sure.
yeah, okay. All right. So our next paper is by Andreea Lachsz and Monique Hurley. Why practices that could be torture, cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment should never form part of the public health response to the COVID-19 pandemic in prisons. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Monique. I'm a lawyer at the Human Rights Law Centre, and I'm presenting today alongside my colleague and dear friend, Andreea. formerly of the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service and a Churchill Fellow and PhD candidate. Just to start, we're both feeling very privileged today to be here at the conference on Wurundjeri country and pay our respects to elders past and present. The land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And at the outset, acknowledge that prisons are institutions born out of invasion in this country and that the harms inflicted by them are disproportionately borne by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As Claire just said, our presentation today is on why practices that could be torture, cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment should never have formed part of the response to COVID in Australian prisons. And that's based on a paper that we co-authored together last year. In terms of the structure, we don't have any slides, but I'm going to speak briefly about trends in prison conditions during the pandemic with a focus on the widespread use of solitary confinement. Andreea will then speak briefly about how the pandemic has re-emphasised the need for greater oversight and monitoring of prisons in compliance with the United Nations Anti-Torture Treaty, the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, or OPCAT, and also give a quick update on OPCAT implementation in Australia. We'll then conclude by looping back to where we start this presentation and connect with broader calls for decarceration and the need to reduce the number of people being pipelined into prisons beyond the pandemic. And that's also where we're going to begin. So at the outset of the pandemic, significant advocacy was done by people in prison, as well as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander human rights and legal organisations, calling to reduce the number of people in prison because of the potential harms caused by COVID-19 and the restrictive practices that everybody knew were going to be deployed in response. And I can see a few allies in the room who were a really integral part of that work. We did a lot of that work with the Change the Record Coalition and Fitzroy Legal Service, who played, a really important role during the early days of the pandemic, trying to advocate for governments to take action. But despite those calls coming on top of an increasing body of evidence demonstrating that prisons undermine community safety, governments across the country failed to do the right and responsible thing and reduce the number of people in prisons during the pandemic. Instead, during the beginning and the peak of the pandemic, and still today in some cases, the primary responses were twofold: arbitrary quarantine and use of lockdowns. The ways in which these practices were deployed often met the definition for solitary confinement set by the Mandela rules, being the confinement of people in prison for 22 or more hours a day without meaningful human contact, and met the threshold for cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment pursuant to the Convention Against Torture. Prior to the pandemic, solitary confinement was already authorised by law in all Australian jurisdictions. While the laws in each state and territory don't necessarily use the language of solitary confinement, practices such as isolation, seclusion, segregation and separation can all amount to solitary confinement in how they're used in practice. The harms of solitary confinement are really well documented. Sharon Charlev in particular has done extensive work documenting the remarkable consistency in research findings on the impacts of solitary confinement. Her work has established that all studies considering non-voluntary solitary confinement of more than 10 days have resulted in negative psychological effects. It can cause long-term irreversible harm, and as found by the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, has a particularly detrimental impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As a result of the broad powers that permit people to be detained in solitary confinement, the practice has increasingly been used in Australia as a carceral tool and as a substitute for proper physical and mental health care. It's a tool of control, not care, and its use during the COVID-19 pandemic was no exception. So firstly, in terms of arbitrary quarantine, that resulted in people in prison being required to spend 14 days, often in conditions that amounted to solitary confinement, prior to being admitted to the general prison population. Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland all introduced laws or policies to enable this to take place. In Queensland, the Commissioner for Corrective Services confirmed at the time that people entering prisons would be subjected to 14 days in isolation, in conditions that amounted to solitary confinement, given that people were to be confined in cells with no out-of-cell time. In Victoria, we made freedom of information requests for the advice justifying the arbitrary use of quarantine and received a handful of emails in response. They showed that the approach taken in Victoria was based on an alarming absence of robust, concrete health advice, and that minimal consideration was given to the mental health impacts of isolation. Yet arbitrary quarantine persisted, and prisons provided time out of cell for people where it was deemed operationally possible. During 2020, the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service reported that some men in quarantine only had 15 minutes out of cell a day, and that some women only had 40 minutes. Alarmingly, while quarantine periods have reduced in places like Victoria, laws that were specifically passed to enable such quarantine to take place have lapsed, but such practices now apparently appear permitted within the existing legislative framework. For example, while it was previously recognised that this arbitrary 14-day quarantine required new specific legislative powers, more recent approaches like the reduction in quarantine to 7 days, and then the recent switch to the current approach where people entering prison are detained in quarantine until they return 2 negative rats taken 24 hours apart, have been justified apparently by the government by reference to existing laws that allow people to be isolated. So secondly, and similarly, the use of lockdowns has become more normalised as a result of the pandemic. Lockdowns were and continue to be the preferred response when staff and people in prison test positive to COVID-19, or when staffing shortages are triggered because of the pandemic. An increase in general powers to limit the movement of people in prisons were enacted in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland again. And of particular note, during 2020, at one point, Victoria had 6 prisons and 2 youth prisons, all in lockdown simultaneously. Lockdowns for days and weeks on end have been commonplace across Australia, with lockdowns reported across the country, and particularly in New South Wales, Queensland and the Northern Territory. And staffing issues related to COVID-19 have been used to justify the ongoing use of lockdowns in youth prisons in Victoria, some as recent as June this year. This is all in circumstances where, as recently as November, the United Nations Committee Against Torture reiterated that solitary confinement should only ever be used in exceptional circumstances as a last resort and for as short a period of time as possible, and that it should be banned outright on children. The use of arbitrary quarantine and lockdowns during the pandemic and their ongoing use, we say highlights the need for greater oversight and monitoring of prisons, which Andreea will now speak about.
Thanks, Mon. Hi, everyone. And so flowing on from what Monique was just talking about, there's a real need to have that sort of ongoing regular visits to places of detention. And as we heard from our first panelists, it's hard to get access to places of detention sometimes. So it's really important to have that sort of transparency in these places. So I'm going to apologize for the various technical terms and acronyms I'm about to throw at you, but I'm going to talk about the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, also known as OPCAT. And it's a UN protocol that aims to prevent mistreatment in all places where people are or may be deprived of their liberty. So that's the really key sort of aspect here. It's about prevention before the harm has happened to people, because as Monique was just talking about, solitary confinement can have lifelong impacts, and we want to avoid that to begin with. So the Australian government ratified OPCAT in 2017, and so it voluntarily signed up to obligations, which included establishing or nominating an independent body or bodies to undertake this preventive work, and that's inclusive of regular visits to places of deprivation of liberty. In Australia, a number of these bodies have already been nominated at the federal, state and territory level, and collectively those bodies will be known as the National Preventive Mechanism, or the NPM. Some jurisdictions have not yet taken that step though. So for example, the Commonwealth Ombudsman has responsibility for doing that preventive work in immigration detention and places that of detention that are under control of the Australian Federal Police and the Australian Defence Force. And additional to that, because as you can imagine, with lots of different bodies, someone needs to have a bit of a coordination function. So the Commonwealth Ombudsman will also be taking that on, or has taken that on. So that's kind of the first tier, the domestic sort of obligations. And then there's the international sort of preventive function, which is carried out by the United Nations Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture. So another acronym for you, the SPT, the subcommittee, and that one of the obligations that the Australian government has signed up to is ensuring that when the subcommittee visits Australia, that it has access to all places of detention, to people who are deprived of their liberty, and relevant information, including medical information. And so with solitary confinement being a practice that can amount to torture and ill treatment, if there had been that national preventive mechanism set up and operational throughout the pandemic, we would imagine that solitary confinement would have been one of their areas of focus, because the whole purpose of the OPCAT is to prevent torture and cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment. So likely they would have focused on the extent to which the practice is permitted by Australian laws and was actually deployed in prisons. So during the pandemic, the UN issued guidance that existing oversight bodies, MPMs around the world, should continue exercising their visiting mandate, recognising the potential exposure to the risk of ill treatment faced by those people in places of detention may be heightened as a consequence of public health measures taken, which Monique has just spoken about. The UN centred the do no harm principle in its guidance, noting that the responsibility of preventive bodies extends to the public, staff, and personnel working in detention facilities. So that there was an expectation that they would adapt their methodology to take into account those considerations. And in fact, what we did see around the world was that during the pandemic, preventive bodies in other jurisdictions continued their work focused on preventing torture and ill treatment, including prolonged solitary confinement. And issues relating to solitary confinement and restrictive practices were, for example, repeatedly highlighted by one of the MPM bodies in the UK, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons. So they had a range of, they continued to conduct visits, and their reports focused on solitary confinement. And what's really important to realise in that context is that the Inspectorate's critical role during this time of heightened risk of ill treatment was recognised by the detaining authorities themselves, even though there were general restrictions imposed in the community. So the Prison Authority in England stated that it unequivocally supported authoritative, independent, and transparent scrutiny as a general principle, and regards it as vitally important in the COVID-19 crisis. And it welcomed the sensible adaptations and safeguards that the Inspectorate put in place during this period. So prior to the pandemic, there was an important global quantitative and qualitative study, and it was looking at the impact of torture prevention measures over a period of 3 decades and looking at 14 different countries. And it confirmed in that study for the first time that torture prevention does work. And it concluded that in torture prevention, consistent prosecution of torturers is probably required. So that's separate to the OPCAT. And importantly, that domestic monitoring practices have less impact in reducing the incidence of torture than detention safeguards, somewhat less than the prosecution of torturers, but distinctly more than complaints mechanisms. And we know there's a real kind of reliance on complaints mechanisms. So that's a really important study that demonstrates that those regular visits and monitoring are absolutely crucial. So, knowing all of this, how do we learn from it, ensure that governments across Australia do the right thing and take steps now to prevent torture behind bars? When Australia ratified OPCAT, it sought a 3-year postponement to meet its obligations, including establishing an operational MPM, and then it requested a further 1-year extension. And I feel like I keep talking about this looming deadline that keeps getting pushed back, but we have the looming deadline on the 20th of January next year. So by that date, the expectation is, the obligation is for the federal, state and territory governments to have nominated or established those OPCAT compliant bodies to visit places of detention. But as I've already said, not all places, not all states and territories have in fact done that. And there's significant inconsistency for those jurisdictions that have nominated their NPM bodies. There's inconsistency around the legislative framework that will be underpinning the work that they do. So ensuring that they have all of those powers, privileges and immunities that are stipulated in the OPCAT. But what is consistent is the sort of conspicuous lack of funding, additional funding for this new and really important function. So in November this year, as Monique's already referred to, Australia appeared before the UN Committee Against Torture, and the committee concluded that Australia should take all necessary measures to promptly establish its NPM across all states and territories, and ensure that each of its bodies has the necessary resources and functional and operational independence to fulfill its preventive mandate in accordance with the OPCAT, including access to all places of deprivation of liberty as prioritised by the NPMs themselves. So those oversight bodies do an assessment of where the highest risk of torture or ill treatment is, and then they determine their visiting schedule. One expert member of that committee, the UN committee, commented that noticing the huge amount of financial resources that Australia... Oh, sorry. Okay. Sure, no worries. Okay, so they said, noticing the huge amount of financial resources that Australia puts into their prison system, we don't think that the financing of NPMs is really a financial problem. It would be more, could be more a problem of the will of particular responsible entities to deal with this problem. This is set against the backdrop of the Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture suspending its first ever visit to Australia in October this year. The subcommittee concluded that there had been a clear breach of Australia of its obligations under OPCAT, citing reasons for the suspension of this visit, including that it had been prevented from visiting several places where people were detained. Critically, there's still an opportunity for Australia to address the subcommittee's concerns within a reasonable timeframe so that it can resume its visit and provide that expert advice on how to prevent torture and ill treatment, such as excessive use of solitary confinement across the country. Australia is currently under extensive international scrutiny with regards to its track record on preventing torture and ill treatment. Having voluntarily agreed to meet the obligations under the OPCAT, it must, as a matter of urgency, take those necessary steps to set up an operational NPM across the country. We have like one more minute.
So just to conclude, these are kind of our wrap-up points and take-home messages. So time is overdue for the federal government to show national leadership on ending torture behind bars through OPCAT implementation. And this starts with two things: urgently committing to adequately and jointly fund oversight bodies with the states and territories, and working with state and territory governments to ensure that the recently suspended visit of the Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture is resumed. And beyond this, governments across Australia, and particularly Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, need to take urgent action to engage in full and transparent consultations with civil society to implement OPCAT as a matter of priority, given the looming January 2023 deadline that Andreea referenced.
So discussions about best practice, OPCAT compliant visits to prisons, youth prisons, police custody, and other places of deprivation of liberty must always be accompanied by discussions about the need to reduce the number of people being pipelined into prisons in the first place. The Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture has made clear that the preventive mandate of the OPCAT is broad, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has echoed this, stating that avoiding depriving a person of their liberty is one of the most effective safeguards against torture and ill treatment. Prisons are inherently harmful environments, and governments at all levels need to urgently reduce the number of people being funneled into them. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Monique and Andreea. We'll just have 2 minutes for questions. I'm sorry, but I realise that we have Aurelius Francisco and Katrina Ward online too, but we'll go a short question and then we'll go straight to you. We'll go do online. Are you sure? Yeah, okay.
Definitely.
All right, so a question for Andreea and Monique. No, can I just pose a quick comment if you want to respond quickly? It's really interesting to see how the state uses a crisis moment to seize an opportunity for more control. And so how confident are you that these might recede over time, or do you see these becoming more entrenched, these kind of forms of isolation that you talked about, and punitive measures, control measures, lockdowns as a result of COVID?
I guess like when Monique and I wrote this paper during the pandemic, we anticipated that these sort of practices could become normalized. And that's why it was really important for us to work with, as Monique has said, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and people who are incarcerated, to prevent these sort of practices becoming entrenched. So I think it's a case of you have to push back at every single step. It's harder to wind back these things once they become normalized, and once staff become dependent on them as a tool of managing places of detention.
Yeah. And I think like we've seen recently, the youth justice crisis and use of lockdowns and isolation on children in prisons, Banksia Hill in WA, Dondale and Alice Springs up in the NT, Ashley in Tasmania. It's, you know, that's like just not connected to COVID necessarily, but like the normalization of lockdowns and isolation as a prison practice as a way to try and control people and their behaviors is like a massive issue.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, it's something we're increasingly aware of through all of these panels. I'll just pass to thanks. To Aurelius. I hope I'm pronouncing your first name properly. Aurelius Francisco and Katrina Ward, who are coming into us via Zoom, speaking about carceral control and resistance in Oklahoma, a protest oral history. And so great to see you here online. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us. We have some slides. Can you hear us okay? Yeah. Yes. Okay, wonderful.
Can you all see that?
I can't see them now.
You
Y'all
can
can
see
see
them?
that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, wonderful.
I'm gonna leave it here because when it goes full screen, it does some weird things. So we're really excited to be here. It is almost midnight here for me, and it's 1 a.m. for Aurelius, so bear with us. We're a little bit tired. My name is Katrina Ward. I use she, they pronouns. We're zooming in tonight from the ancestral lands of the Apache, Arapaho, Caddo, Comanche, Kiowa, Osage, and Wichita tribes.
Hello, everybody. My name is Aurelius Francisco. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a writer and community organizer from the east side of Oklahoma City. It's great to be with you all today, this evening, this morning. Yeah.
Whatever time it is.
Yeah, whatever.
For those of you who might not be familiar, Oklahoma is a state in the Great Plains of the U.S. It's sort of the South, but not really. There's a lot of disagreement about what region we're actually in. When you think of Oklahoma, you might think of cowboys and a very flat landscape with lots of tornadoes, which is accurate, and where we're starting to give context for this presentation. Because there's been a lot of bad stuff that's happened in Oklahoma, we need to talk about it before we get to all the good. So we're going to start by talking about the land run. In 1889, not even 40 years after the forced relocation of indigenous tribes across the US to Oklahoma, the government opened the unassigned lands for claim by white settlers. There are currently cases being heard that challenge tribal sovereignty after the original treaties were reaffirmed just a few years ago in the McGirt case.
Yeah, so following that, shortly after statehood was established in 1907, the first bill that our legislature in Oklahoma passed worked to codify Jim Crow segregation as the law of the land in the state of Oklahoma. So the fact that this was the first law passed, the first priority passed by a legislature in Oklahoma says a lot about our priorities, and it really does set the tone for ongoing harm and violence through legislation and carceral means throughout our history.
Yeah, Oklahoma is also the site of one of the worst racial massacres in the US. At its height, Greenwood, also known as Black Wall Street, was the epicenter of Black wealth and success in America. In 1921, white residents, the police, and the National Guard burnt Greenwood down. There's still no consensus on how many Black people were murdered, but estimates are anywhere from 50 to 300 people. The city of Tulsa has begrudgingly uncovered multiple mass graves tied to the massacre, but has displayed a general lack of acknowledgement of the massacre itself and the presence of continuing racism. The group Justice for Greenwood is currently suing Tulsa for reparations, seeking to classify the race massacre and continuing legacies of racism and destruction the Black community in North Tulsa has experienced as a public nuisance and a part of the continuing violence against Black folks in Oklahoma.
So a core part of this ongoing violence that we've seen within the carceral state in Oklahoma shows this prison policies 2021 incarceration report, which is shown here, identifies Oklahoma as having the highest per capita incarceration rate in the US as compared with other countries across the world. Oklahoma at its peak in 2018 was #1 for incarcerating people in women's facilities and #2 for incarcerating people in men's facilities. After some continued organizing efforts and positive policy reform, we have dropped a bit on those lines. We are currently sitting around 3 and 4 respectively, but still nowhere close to where we want to be as it relates to decarceration. Oklahoma continues to have realities of very harsh punishments, prosecutorial misconduct, and the war on drugs really does continue to ravage communities in Oklahoma and loading our jails and prisons. Additionally, our legislature and governor continue to push legislation that further criminalizes our people.
You may have heard of our governor, Kevin Stitt. He's really made a name for himself for being truly awful for so many marginalized groups and for signing a lot of really harmful legislation. This is a picture of him signing an abortion ban, which was one of the first and is the strictest abortion ban in the US. And it's only one of 3 abortion bills passed in the last year that limit and criminalize abortion care. He also advocated for and signed House Bill 1775, which bans what the legislature is calling critical race theory. But the bill essentially says that you can't talk about race or discrimination at all in schools or anything that could make anyone feel bad. This obviously limits teachers' ability to talk about Oklahoma's own history and how it's influencing the present.
Yes, and there have also been several anti-protest bills that have been signed into law that restrict protesters' abilities and right to assemble, as well as more harshly criminalizing protesting and reclassifying a whole lot of protest actions as riots. Which allows for larger, more robust criminalization and penalties to be enacted on protesters, which was seen during the George Floyd protests of 2020, when the Oklahoma County DA charged young protesters with terrorism. One of those anti-protest laws also includes immunity for people who run over protesters out of fear for their life. This bill was passed right after a truck driver ran through protesters in Tulsa during 2020. There have been multiple other instances where cars have driven through protests in Oklahoma, and the language of this bill allows for broad and extremely subjective arguments surrounding fear for life that have many biases embedded within them.
In addition to these kinds of violent reactions to protests, we've also had a lot of engagement with armed white supremacists and counter-protesters. These images are from a protest at the Oklahoma Land Run Monument in downtown OKC. Things got pretty tense on this day, but everyone did walk away from this instance okay. As we prioritize harmful and oppressive legislation and expanding gun rights, we're also not doing a lot at state or local levels to address actual needs within our community. As you can see here, US News ranks us overall 43 out of 50 states. Our healthcare ranks at 48th, education is 42nd, crime and corrections is 44th. Our public policy really focuses on channeling money into things that don't help the material needs of everyday Oklahomans.
Yeah, so with all of this, all of these repressive forces, harmful policies and legislation that we've discussed so far, some may believe, and when we travel, across the country and talk to people about Oklahoma and our work as organizers and researchers in Oklahoma, some may believe and tend to believe that Oklahoma's resistance to these carceral apparatuses aren't strong. But it's actually quite the contrary. It's because of Oklahoma's long history of movement building and resistance that Oklahoma is the way it is. And so we wanted to draw out this quote from Robin D.G. Kelly, who's a great historian out of UC Berkeley in California. He says that the South is the most radical place in this country. The reason why it's so repressive is because it's the most radical place. He says that Black people and all people, including poor whites, came up under fascism in the South. That's true, and it continues. But the South is a place where you find the most vibrant, most militant oppositional movements. And that's true in the case of Oklahoma. And so we want to look at some of this history that Oklahoma has as it relates to resistance and to building robust movements. And so the first case that we want to look at is the socialist support that was very strong in Oklahoma in the early 20th century. And so in 1915, there were more registered Socialist Party members in Oklahoma than in New York. The Green Corn Rebellion, which occurred in August of 1917, included tenant farmers in Seminole County, Oklahoma, so in rural Oklahoma, who were resisting the military draft of World War I, and they sought to end the war by marching to Washington and uprising against the U.S. government and American capitalism. The rebellion was an alliance between mostly white Oklahoma farmers who allied with Black migrants and Native peoples to rebel. This rebellion faced haste opposition and several people died in conflict. Hundreds of others were arrested, but nonetheless, many may be surprised that the heart of American socialism in the early 20th century was indeed in rural Oklahoma. Another example of Oklahoma's history of resistance is found at the onset of the civil rights movement, where one of the first sit-ins to desegregate a local restaurant and drugstore in Oklahoma City, which was Katz Drugstore, occurred. This action was led by Claire Looper, who was a longtime educator and activist in Oklahoma City, who led the sit-in along with her young students. The Katz sit-in occurred in August of 1958, which you might note is 2 years before the more well-known Greensboro sit-in of 1960. So one of the first examples that we have in the US of direct action to desegregate our country happened right here in Oklahoma City.
Oklahomans also participated in the 1979 American Agricultural Movement Motor Tractorcade, which sent farmers on tractors from all 50 states to Washington, D.C. after their Fair Deal for Family Farmers failed in the House. Amidst record high farm foreclosures and farmer suicides, 60,000 of these farmers drove 100 miles a day to get there and were welcomed by local farmers along the route at night. While in DC, the farmers used their tractors to help the city manage emergency responses in a snowstorm and took up the entire mall for 3 months. This movement built capacity for ongoing organizing and legislation and is of special interest to our project because it's a moment where, according to AAM, farmers who once had considered it a disgrace to be outside the law were now picketing and demonstrating and participating in direct action.
Yeah, and so now looking more into today, into the present, this history of resistance really does continue. And so one of the most prominent examples of this in recent memory were protests relating to freeing Julius Jones, who's pictured here. Julius Jones is a Black man who was wrongfully convicted of murdering an Edmond, which is a white and affluent suburb of Oklahoma City, an Edmond businessman in 1999. Julius sat on Oklahoma's death row for over 20 years, despite strong evidence of his innocence, including a juror who helped to convict him, reportedly using a racial slur to refer to him, saying that we should go out back and hang him. There was a large groundswell of support across the state and really across the country for Julius's freedom in the years leading up to his execution. A petition was pushed out that granted more than 7 million signatures, and the people of Oklahoma by the thousands came out to take action to say no to this potential execution. In 2021, the Pardon and Parole Board did vote to recommend clemency of Julius's sentence. But Governor Stitt, our state's governor, dragged his feet until the day Julius was set to be executed, November 18th. Governor Stitt waited until 3 hours before Julius was set to be executed to release a statement stating that Julius's sentence would be commuted to life without the possibility of parole. So still punishing Julius and sentencing him to death, but by another means. So the fight for Julius's freedom still continues. But the fact that in a state like Oklahoma that as we speak currently is carrying out executions on the monthly and has scheduled executions through 2024, the fact that we were able to ensure that this Black man was not executed is a testament to the strong nature of resistance in Oklahoma.
Yeah, in 2019, Sue for Solidarity, Dream Action Oklahoma, ACLU of Oklahoma, and Indigenous groups, including the American Indian Movement, held a protest at Fort Sill in Lawton, Oklahoma. This military base had previously been used as an internment camp for Japanese Americans and was proposed to now hold children separated from their families at the border. This protest really highlighted the intersecting ways that carcerality harms different communities in Oklahoma.
And so as we saw in much of the world after the police killings, thank you for that note, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and many others, the summer of 2020 was a true uprising in the state of Oklahoma. People by the thousands came out of the middle of the pandemic to call for Black people's ability to live without the threat of police violence. And in these protests, you saw direct confrontations with the police, tear gas, rubber bullets shot into crowds, curfews put into effect by the mayor of Oklahoma City, which really endangered the lives of hundreds of people. And so these run-ins with the police have really created the need for protest and for resistance. And so the Department of Justice is actually currently investigating Oklahoma City Police Department and the entire state of Oklahoma for using police to respond to mental health crisis instead of providing adequate mental health care to Oklahoma residents.
Some of these historical protests we've talked about are fairly well known, but others are not. And there hasn't been a collective study of the history of protest in Oklahoma as beyond individual events. Because Aurelius and I are both community organizers, we want to look more broadly at the ways in which protest has worked and failed in Oklahoma with the goal of learning how to do it better. To this end, we are creating a community archive of protest history. We've begun collecting oral histories from community members, activists, and organizers. We know these people won't be with us forever, and the preservation of their voices is a sacred practice. Oral history is a method that focuses on long-form, loosely structured personal narratives, and will be paired with digital humanities efforts, mapping and archiving. Our oral histories currently focus on people who have organized protests, but we plan to expand to elders, youth activists, people who've just attended and experienced protests. And we've also talked about potentially interviewing police to explore the values and beliefs that underlie their outsized response to protest in Oklahoma. We keep seeing new ways that this project can expand, whether that's through community protest trainings, building capacity for community archiving practices, or a bunch of new projects that we're now planning to do that branch off of this one. We'll continue to work on this for as long as we can.
Yeah, and so just in closing here, some of the themes that have surfaced in the several interviews that we've conducted so far. We've seen a few big moments as catalyzing action, including the election of Donald Trump in 2016, the Lawton Close the Camps protest, the wave of protest after the murder of George Floyd, and the Julius Jones actions. We have also talked about how the new laws limiting protest, as well as actions by the Oklahoma County DA, have changed the way folks are willing and able to show up. And those conversations were actually our entrance into this project.
We're also working with the expanded definition of protest that looks beyond protest as a singular event tied to a particular spatial and temporal moment, recognizing that many people are forced into this work because of their positionalities and lived experiences. This shows up in embodied experience of protest, where organizers are able to push through fear to keep others safe, and also in the spatial distributions of violence directed towards protesters.
We're also exploring the duality of joy and violence present in protest spaces, the space that is created within a protest, and the ways policing can shatter the feelings of community connection. Ruthie Gilmore has said that freedom is a place, and we have seen how solidarity can practice freedom in protest spaces.
Something that has also really surprised us is how our narrators have responded to the actual act of doing these oral histories. When we do oral histories, we put in the Institutional Review Board document that the benefit to participants is that they'll feel validated by having people listen to their stories, but that's always felt a little abstract. But in every single one of these interviews, people we're talking with have thanked us and said they hadn't actually had the space to process what had happened to them. Multiple people have shared that they spoke about things with us that they normally didn't talk about, and no one had ever asked them about the ongoing embodied impacts of protests. It's been really powerful so far.
Yeah, and so we're incredibly excited to continue this work and look forward to reporting back as we get the archive up and running. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Aurelius and Katrina, for that really interesting presentation. So we've got just a couple more minutes for questions. Any questions in the room?
Oh, it was too good.
Too good? Yes.
Thank you guys so much. Super interesting. Can you hear me okay? I'm curious, given the directionality of the quote that you cited of sort of the radical nature of social movements following from, or sorry, the oppression of the state following from the radical nature and not the other way around. Whether you've encountered Jordan Camp's work at all, Incarcerating the Crisis is his book. And his argument is that protests and liberatory movements are racialized and used as an opportunity to extend the oppressive reach of the carceral state. My question is whether you've seen any evidence of that, where these protests are spun as riots or used as a moment for the state to clear out a housing project or increase arrest rates or increase sentencing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. Yeah, go ahead, Katrina. Lot of
we one of the things that comes to mind the most for me is there were folks moving from a peaceful protest. We've also talked a lot about the use of peaceful by organizers and people looking at protests. There were people moving from a protest in the park towards the police station because there was a meeting happening between some elders in the community. And there was a helicopter with someone who was a meteorologist who was looking down on the protest. And he pointed at someone who was getting a water bottle out of a backpack and said, "That guy has weapons." It was a young Black man. And then he had to deal with like the implications of that being on TV. And the police actually were listening to that broadcast and were militarized and ready for these protesters who didn't have weapons. They were sharing water when people got there. And we've also seen increased violence and increased incarceration in the past couple of years. We have had as many jail deaths as Rikers in Oklahoma County. And we've also now voted to build a new, bigger jail. So yeah, they're definitely using it as an excuse to increase incarceration. Aurelius, do you want to add anything?
Nope, you hit on it.
Okay, any other questions in the room? Probably have time for just one more.
Thank you.
They can still hear you anyway.
Do you hear me? Yes, perfect. Okay, then thank you very much. Do you also include kind of invisible resistance, which is maybe not open protest in the street, but as you already said, like some people are more affected like by repression and so people who have different forms of maybe not open protest, but of strategically invisibilized forms of resistance. Do you include that in that archive?
Yeah, so we've looked at that in several of the interviews that we've done so far, that has just sort of like come up organically and that we've sort of been thinking about just in the questions that we're asking, a more expansive view of protest. And in all of the interviews, like our interviewees have talked about protest in the like very literal sense, but also protest in a more abstract sort of existence as resistance, but also other forms of like centering risk assessment, especially with the recent anti-protest bills that have made it significantly more easy to criminalize protesters, different ways to make noise and to add pressure to policymakers to bring about change, whether it's digital organizing, or just, you know, like creating event space that sort of serves as a protest, but doesn't look like a rally or a direct action of some kind. And so, yeah, I think sort of the expansive view of protesting is definitely a piece, but that invisibilizing of protest that you're using isn't something specifically. So we'll definitely take a note of that and think more critically on it. So thank you for that. And thanks to the last person for the book recommendation.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Katrina and Aurelius, and thank you for doing this at midnight or 1 a.m. or whatever time it was there. So next presentation is Andrew Burridge, titled Non-care in the Detention. Okay, we've got Andrew Burridge with Non-care in the Detention Hotel, 20 years of Australia's use of alternative places of detention, 2002 to 2022, and I'll just get up your slides.
Thanks very much, and thanks to all the speakers. Quite tough acts to follow. I'll set my clock and I'll try and keep myself on time, but stop me. And I realize it's the end of the day. Thank you for sticking around, and I realize I'm the person between you and maybe the bar. I guess also I want to reflect this morning. I was still thinking about this morning's amazing plenary and the discussion around lived experience. Of course, this is a discussion in which I have no lived experience, but also about how we center voices, but that dualism of then how do you avoid placing additional work and burdens and trauma on those who experience these spaces as well. So forgive me for some shortcomings, and we can certainly discuss that. But there is that question about who gets to study these spaces and the risk of the kind of fetishization by academics sometimes of these kinds of spaces that we're discussing. I'm also thankful to the other speakers who mentioned Ruthie Gilmore and others. I'm a former student of Ruthie's, so always thinking about what is the purpose of this work as well. This is also some collaborative work. We also look at an international context, looking at hotels comparatively, but I'm going to focus here on Australia. I also want to note, just finally, the final proviso, that this is not a discussion about what is good forms of detention and bad forms. This is all a scale of bad types of worse. So what I'm not trying to set up here is a discussion that says there's something better than hotels, but this is what we're going to look at. And of course, if you look out the window, you can actually see one of the former hotels that I'll come to speak about. I think you can literally see it out the window in a city that is known as a refugee welcome zone. So what am I talking about? So today, and we can move on to the next slide, thank you. There's been no comprehensive study of Australia's use of what are classified alternative places of detention that have been conducted. Considering the longer historical trajectory and purpose and connection to the broader onshore and offshore detention landscape that most of you probably are more familiar with. Further, no publicly available comprehensive documentation of APODs exists. Their location, number of detainees held, and other information remains difficult to trace, and at times purposely obfuscated by government agencies. It is the hidden nature of the hotels, coupled with outsourcing of security and minimal independent oversight, that our research argues further contributes to practices and outcomes of non-care for detainees. And while I'm talking here about the Australian context, it can also, of course, draw upon the US. The Corrections Corporation of America began its business as the largest private prison company, first through the use of hotels in 1983 to detain migrants. So that's where CCA began. So less known here in Australia, alongside offshore detention, and of course we're hearing from Burridge and others, is the use of APODs for the last 20 years, and quite literally last week marked 20 years, 2nd of December. So in December of 2002, the Migration Series Instruction, or MSI 371 on alternative places of detention was issued by the then Department of Immigration and Multicultural and Indigenous Affairs with a specific purpose, at least this is how it's phrased, I don't particularly agree with this, but about facilitating early interventions for the transfer of women and children, of providing care, of removing women and children, particularly out of detention environments. Now, we can argue about whether that was the actual purpose, and certainly what is the outcome now. Several definitions of APODs can now be found within Australian federal government policy, as well as in reports from human rights organisations. Perhaps most usefully, a definition drawn from the Human Rights Commissioner, and I'm going to pick on Stephen a little bit here as well, and put him out, and the Commonwealth Ombudsman acknowledged the broad array of facilities that may be incorporated. And so these can include places such as correctional centres, hospitals, psychiatric facilities, foster care arrangements, or with a designated person at a private residence. So all these other ways that we can think about and locate detention, but particularly here, we're going to look at hotels. And for at least of you here resident in Australia, you might be aware of hotels, particularly over the last few years. We want to look at the longer trajectory. And that begins with, in Australia, the Carver Court Motel here in Adelaide back to about 2003. As far as I can tell, the first use of a hotel to detain someone, in this instance, a pregnant woman who had been removed from Baxter, one of the former really remote detention facilities. And I highly recommend reading the work of Joseph Pugliese at Macquarie University, who has written very much about the Akaba Court. If we can move on to the next slide. So it is now well established, and I don't need to tell anyone in this room, that immigration detention, though typically administrative by definition, is more accurately understood and experienced as punitive, particularly due to the prison-like or carceral nature of detention facilities, something I don't think I need to argue in this room. Whether as a site of detention or a more permeable state of carceral accommodation, we argue that the role of the hotel as an appropriated infrastructure, so this kind of use of ad hoc, non-purpose-built detention facilities, is one of fixing migrants or asylum seekers, often temporarily, to specific locations. And as McNeil from their 2008 work on the city and the hotel argues, not talking about detention, but the role of hotels within cities, hotels have long played a significant role, quote, in temporarily fixing mobile bodies. But we think about this in a very different way normally. Drawing the distinct connection to their use for the detention, in this fixing of bodies, Davison from 2018 in his book on the hotel states that, quotes, the hotel, the archetypical space of the modern traveller, is particularly well suited for integration into interdiction practices. That is the flipping from a place of sort of respite and welcome to one of interdiction and incarceration. And Davison here was looking globally at Canada and France and elsewhere where hotels have been used. So hotels then as sites of sorting and classifying highly adaptable spaces that can be and have been used to both accommodate and incarcerate different groups. In this sense, then, we suggest that hotels can be understood as forms of flexible infrastructure that can be adapted to provide carceral fixes, drawing on the work of Ruthie Gilmore, but also others. Because, as Sarah Fregonesi and Adam Ramadan noted in their work on the geopolitics of hotels, quote, hotels are transient spaces for temporary dwelling, not permanent habitation, and they can therefore easily be emptied and reconfigured in times of conflict and crisis. So more recently then, in the use of hotels for medevac transfers in Australian cities, the transfer of folks from offshore sites, little was changed to the structure and appearance of the hotels beyond the stationing of security guards to prevent access by the general public. Effectively, nothing else really changed in the rooms. Those detained describe their detention as being within, quote, torture hotels and, quote, prisons. Over the last decade, the Human Rights Commissioner has regularly reported in its observations of the detention landscape that hotel APODs are more restrictive than purpose-built detention facilities. The example here being taken from Darwin in 2010 of the Asti Motel, no longer used, but as being the most restrictive space at that time in the Northern Territory. And you can imagine being held in that room. Okay, next slide. So to think then about non-care, the use of APODs typically located within urban areas of major cities, often in contrast to this idea we often have or practice of remote detention, but literally outside the window, were initially connected to the need for care and medical services, as I mentioned, that could not be provided within remote detention facilities, both onshore and offshore. Access to the provision of care whilst held in an APOD, however, is highly contingent. While health and wellbeing issues of detainees transferred from detention facilities may be further compounded or exacerbated by the cramped and isolated conditions of hotels, motels, and other APOD sites, particularly highlighted by those held during the COVID-19 pandemic. But this is not at all about COVID-19. These issues existed well before, hotel detention well before. We just became more aware of it perhaps over the last 2 years. Hotel APODs can therefore be framed as specific spaces of cramping and choking for those detained within. And as William Walters noted in their work on cramping, quote, cramped space registers degrees of deprivation, constriction, and obstruction. And that form of discomfort is central to the understandings of such spaces as hotels and other detention facilities. Cramping and choking, and I'm drawing particularly here on the work of Martina Tazioli, the inability to move freely or to breathe has been central to the descriptions of hotel APODs, particularly since their use for larger cohorts of detainees, starting with the Asti Hotel complex in the previous slide and continuing through to the Park Hotel in Melbourne in 2020. I think this is actually the mantra, but much the same. And this has been, as I mentioned, referred to as a prison and a torture hotel by those who are detained. This is not my words. While media reporting and statements from detainees have demonstrated the severe effects of confinement in rooms never intended for detention, other studies have also found that APODs have significant impacts upon the health and well-being of both adults and children, as shown here, the really important work being done. And of course, we can reflect upon the unsuitability of quarantine and what people experienced in 2 weeks in hotels, in Park Hotel, which was the quarantine hotel before the outbreak, which then determined was actually suitable as a detention facility. So both detainees and detention inspectorate bodies have also noted the frequent lack of sufficient medical and mental health services available within APODs, failing to meet even the very low standards implemented within purpose-built detention facilities. And so we can talk about all kinds of ways of that, as well as access to outside recreation space and so forth that required the transfer to other detention facilities. So you can flip the slide. I won't have much time to talk about what we might classify as carceral churn, and I draw here on Emma Russell and colleagues, and Emma, I know is here at the conference, really important work thinking about the connections between the hotel and the detention centre. And so most reporting that we've seen on the hotel talks about the hotel in isolation, as if it's its own space. But these are highly connected to the detention facility, whether it's a transfer for exercise, which was then shut down during COVID, so no outdoor space, no exercise possible, punishment through transfer into isolation cells in detention facilities, so forth, and of course, being moved from offshore to onshore into the hotels as well. Next slide. I realize I'll run out of time if I go much further into this. Of course, this has been frustrated, the work that we're doing through obfuscation. And here I show redacted freedom of information requests and finally some unredacted, but it took a legal case to do so. We're relying on FOIs, our own and previously submitted reports, Senate estimates, questions, and of course, most importantly, statements from those who are detained. We haven't been conducting interviews, can go into the longer discussion about re-traumatization and the work that's required. But in this modern era, with social media, at least in the last few years, many of the men who were detained through Medivac were able to convey very clearly what was going on. And so drawing upon that as well. Most importantly, a recent request by Nick McKim, Senator, Green Senator, through Senate estimates, resulted in a response from Home Affairs that between 2018 and 2021, and I'll say this clearly, there were 170 alternative places of detention used in Australia at any time, 170. As at 31st of January 2021, 56 APODs were classified as hotel APODs. So 56 hotels were classified to be used. In the recent report by Australian Human Rights Commissioner and the Commonwealth Ombudsman, they noted that there are currently 77 currently classified hotels, I think it is, and 7 that are currently in use. So if we just flip to the last slide, I just want to wrap up in the last minute to talk about some work that we've been doing. Back 2 slides. Around mapping or counter mapping, and drawing on Julia's fantastic presentation earlier, trying to understand the location of these sites, and through 3 years of work, we've come up with 34 of what is clearly, I've just talked about hundreds more sites. Now, if that 170 was including hospitals and so forth, but we're specifically looking at hotels, most of which we've determined are either well-known or through the recent court case of Victorian hotel APODs. These are all previously used. So in terms of current use, we're unclear, but you can go to the Caldor site. We have the map on there that explains a bit more of the process. And it was also in The Guardian last week, which we're very thankful for as well. So just to conclude, what is the purpose of all of this? That is a good question. But I think it's the first step is understanding where these spaces are. We can't know the full scope of the Australian detention landscape. If we don't know that, how do we respond to it? How do we do proper oversight? How do we understand? And we can talk about OPCAT as well. But the hope is that this map and this work will be useful at the very least in bringing attention. If we just go forward 1 more slide. The risk, however, and we are certainly concerned, is that making things visible can come with implications. In the UK, hotels being visible has led to far-right protests, literally doors being kicked in, people being attacked, and so forth. However, the hotels in the UK are not closed. They're a common, quote, accommodation. So it's a very different context. Much of the justification of explaining why we couldn't be told where APODs were here was around risk of protest, but I think the framing from the government of protest is that they're concerned about pro-detention protests, which are pro, refugee or however you want to frame it. Protests, which is effectively all the protests that we saw here was about having people released. And then just finally to note that while we hear about the release of Medivac detainees and the ending of hotel detention, it's still going on today. If you look at the recent statistics, over 80 people are in APODs currently. And we can, if we just go forward to the final slide, you can go, and I stood outside the Brisbane Meriton the other day. Someone is detained on the 42nd floor for years, effectively referred to as solitary confinement, 40-something floors up. So we can think about that this hasn't ended. And the question is, where is this going? If this was initially designed to provide care, where are we today with the use of APODs? And I'll shut up because I've gone well over this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. If everyone's happy to stay just a couple more minutes, if there's any questions. Any questions in the audience? Yes.
Andrew, I love this research project. I've already told you that. It occurs to me that this fragmentation of detention sites, so rather we used to have them, in 6 locations around Australia, and now it's 170 locations. Nobody could possibly provide oversight to all those sites of incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the point of them, do you think?
I don't know. I don't know a lot of the thinking, and there's different perspectives. But yeah, how does one monitor these? How does one understand the true implications? And we've seen that and I guess what's most important, at least to acknowledge with the possibility of social media in the last and media contact, that the release of the men, and we've heard different reasons behind that, but a lot of that was led by their own protest by speaking up about the actual conditions. And so that was so vital at least in the terms of Kangaroo Point at Brisbane, Park Hotel, Mantra, that we heard specifically what those conditions are like. So I think there's so much that, of course, we're never going to see. Most hotels and APODs, as I understood, they usually use short term. So it's very hard if it's just a night or two. But we also know that they're being used long term, as the Commissioner has found, that these are anything but short term, which is how they're framed in policy, that they should be very short term, and people are sometimes there for years. So yeah, the hope is that this allows that at the very least, because I think abolition should be the answer or the outcome, but at the very least, proper monitoring and understanding of the context. Yeah.
Any other questions, including online? Just check the chat.
All good. Let's let these poor people go.
Okay, well,
Just mention before we finish, we're going to be watching the films in the forum, so we can just put it on level 1, but you're on level 1 and just come upstairs in the move around to your right, and it's behind 2 sets of doors, very locked in, it's very nice.
thanks everyone for such a fantastic panel. Yeah, great work. Thank you.